Hello, everyone, and welcome to another special author chat this evening. I'm so thrilled that we have Mac Barnett with us. He's a recipient of a Boston Globe Horn Book Award for Extra Yarn, which also won the E.B. White Read Aloud Award. Extra Yarn and Sam and Dave Dig a Hole were both Caldecott Honour books. Tonight we might be doing something a little different though, because we're going to be talking about a book that Matt has written and is published in Italian called La Porta Segreta. And it is a book for adults about books for children. I know that many of you wanted to ask questions this evening. Some of you have sent me questions, and we do want to make sure that we give you the opportunity to ask those. So after about 15 minutes or so, I'll open the Q&A. So please can I welcome Mac, who's joining us from California, where it's 95 degrees. And all I can say, Mac, is here autumn has started and we're all California dreaming.
Uh, well, congratulations on your beautiful weather. I see. Why are you California dreaming? You have autumn. I want autumn so badly. I was sweltering over here. It's not all it's cracked up to be. I tell you that.
Mm. Should we just have a look at the very fine book jacket cover for La
Yeah.
Porta Segreta? The first question that I wanted to ask you, it's probably really obvious to everyone, but I wanted to ask you how that book jacket, which is Carson Ellis, is it?
That's
How
Carson.
that speaks to the themes in the book.
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, this jacket I agree is so beautiful, and it is done by Carson Ellis. And it's so funny that you say, how does it speak to the themes of the book? Carson made probably 17 possible covers, sketches that were wildly different in concept, and sent them to my editors and art director at Terre de Mezzo, our publisher in Italy, and to me, and we all discussed them. The original version of this cover did not have that silhouetted child reading in that sort of doorway in the butterfly. But there is a secret door, right? La Porta Segreta translates to the secret door, and that's one of the metaphors for books in this book, that they're secret doors that let you into other worlds. But beyond that, it was kind of funny. I think that Carson and I both feel this way about picture books. I think when you put text and an image next to each other, if there's some distance, some tension, some ambiguity about what the relationship is, then the reader, your brain automatically will start to connect those things, right? The picture books work best in illustrated fiction, and so much of children's literature is illustrated fiction, work better when words and illustrations aren't doing the same work, when they're doing something different. And you make it up to the reader, the viewer, to reconcile those two things. That's the most exciting moment for me as a writer, is when the reader gets involved and starts interpreting the story. So it touched on this idea of a secret door, but other associations that butterflies might have with the themes of the book, or with the ideas of children's literature. We were excited about uh, that work that the reader was going to have to do to connect, because that's something that we love about making illustrated fiction for kids, and that we think kids particularly are so well equipped to do, that they're really good at doing work to resolve ambiguities in fiction and art.
Mm. So I also wanted to ask you before we get into the detail of the book. I almost want to go to the end of the book first, which is
Sure.
like section 3. It's called The Secret Door. And there you're talking about some of your formative experiences. And I thought it might be interesting for our audience for you to share some of those. What was it? Because this is what made you the
Yeah.
reader that you are.
Yeah, I think that, I've always loved books. My mom, it was really I was raised by my mom. It was just the two of us growing up, and it was really important to her. She was a single mom who, like, took very seriously. Like she just wanted to do it right. I think that was like a presiding anxiety for her, uh, especially when I was a young kid. And so one of the things she wanted to make sure was that I had access to books. We didn't have a ton of money, so what she would do is she would go around to yard sales and buy books secondhand, sometimes third hand or fourth hand, and she would white out with like corrective fluid the names of the previous owners and write my name in the book. I'm thinking here, by the way, as I'm speaking to the UK, I'm like, yard sale. You guys probably call them something else over there, right? When you call it yard sale,
Well, we sometimes have a boot sale, but
it
I
was a
think
boot sale.
we know what a yard sale is.
All
Yeah.
right. How about whiteout? How about I was like, there's no way you call it whiteout. Is it
No.
Tipex? Is it Tipex? Is that right? Is that what it is?
Tipex, yeah. But we know what
Uh,
it means. We know what
uh-huh.
it means.
Uh, yeah, and I just loved books so much, and I loved reading with my mom. My mom is very funny. She's like one of the funniest people I've ever met, and that experience of like her reading to me and laughing so hard that she was crying, and like I was also laughing at a book. That was really meaningful to be like, wow, this piece of art that I think is so funny is also funny to my mom, and she's an adult and she's really funny. This must really be good. That sort of shared experience around a book was magical and really validating. Um, when I was a little bit older, I started teaching writing to kids. First as a tutor in high school, I would go down to the elementary school and work on reading with elementary school kids who were struggling to learn to read. Uh, and then finally in college, where I was studying writing and I really wanted to be a writer. I hadn't figured out what kind of writing I wanted to do. On my summers off, I started working at a summer camp for 4 to 6 year olds. And I was always in charge of the 4 year olds. I loved the 4 year olds. They were the most work, but they also had, I think, the freest imaginations, and they were just so fun to talk to. It was like talking to a space alien, right? They could understand everything that I wanted to communicate. They could communicate everything they were thinking and feeling, but our perspectives were so different. And it was just like I just had so much fun talking to them every day. I started telling them stories, uh, and I just loved telling stories out loud to them so much. They had a few picture books there in the library, but most of them were really bad. It was a very neglected kind of camp library. But there was one called The Stinky Cheese Man that I had not read as a kid, because it came out when I was a kid, but uh, our books were mostly from the 50s, 60s, and 70s because my mom was buying them at boot sales. Nailed it. And I thought this book was amazing. It's, if you haven't read The Stinky Cheese Man, it's this sort of metafictional, experimental take on fairy tales written by John Sheska and Lane Smith. And it is so funny, so daring, so cerebral. Uh, and I thought when I first picked it up, I was like, I think this is funny. This is right up my alley, but there's no way these 4 year olds are going to get it. And they got it all. And I think sometimes adults flatter themselves when smart things are written for kids. They say like, "Oh, I love this because you put jokes in there for the adults." Um, but more often than not, kids are laughing at those very same jokes that adults are. I think that their brains are very nimble and they're quick to recognize pattern, which is the basis of all humor, right? They don't always have the experience. They don't always have the set of references, but the Stinky Cheese Man is so fantastic because it teaches kids what they need to know as it tells them the joke. So it's sort of like it tells you what the structure is seconds before tearing it down. And I thought, man, if 4 year olds love something like this, a book that is funny and strange and and really bold than maybe some of the weird ideas that I have in my head about the kind of fiction I want to create. Maybe my audience is here because those 4-year-olds were the bravest, most open-minded, most engaged readers I had ever encountered. I was like, this is what I would want out of, imagining up until that point writing for an adult, the sort of ideal mindset of an adult, somebody who is hyper engaged in the text, willing to do the work required of a piece of literature, which is interpretive work, and kind of engaging in this in a sense of play. That's very rare among adults. It's much more common in kids. And so I think that, like, as a whole, kids are actually a much better reader of literary fiction than adults are.
So interesting there to hear you talk about the ideal reader. Um, that might kind of lead us on to one of the first things that I wanted to explore. I cannot tell you how much I love this book. I was cheering almost every paragraph that you wrote. I was saying, yes, 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 we need to, this is a manifesto for children's books and children's reading. One of the first aspects that I want to talk about was didacticism. And it's interesting you mentioned John Sheska there, because of course you went on to write a book with your hero, Battle Bunny. And that kind of speaks to this first idea about didacticism in children's books, I think. So you feel
Yeah,
very strongly about this.
I do. I think that didactic fiction is really overrepresented in kids' books, and that kids' books too often just become another place where adults are telling kids what to do. Um, that's not what fiction is for. It can do that, right? And there's didactic fiction for adults too. There are stories that have a clear lesson or moral. Um, but I think that we know that literature, that literary fiction, that art fiction does something else. That actually fiction, what fiction is best at, and maybe uniquely good at, is at exploring ambiguity, contradiction, complexity, nuance, and that when you use a story just to drive home a simple moral, you're really, it feels like, it's like just driving a jet plane on the freeway. This thing's supposed to fly. Like, why are we only using it for this? I think that you know at the heart of what makes children's literature so strange as an art form is that it is written, edited, designed, published, reviewed, and purchased by people who are not the intended audience. Kids. Kids are our intended audience, right? But there are so many adults. Many of those adults are so distant from the real lives and points of views of actual children. Um, and a story has to go through all of these adult hands before it finally makes it to the person that we purportedly have been making it for. Uh, and that can be very warping because there's a huge power differential between children and adults. And adults usually, and for good reason, have authority over kids. And a lot of the relationship between adults and children is motivated by an adult wanting to pass on knowledge to a child, right? And that's right and good, but it's not the only way that adults and children can interact. And I think that storytelling, fiction, art, children's books are one of the few places where children and adults can engage as equals. And in fact, um, one of the places where that sort of counterintuitive truth becomes clear, that there are a lot of things that children are a lot better at than we adults are. And I think anybody who's read a book with a kid and seen the way that they notice small details in the pictures, or um, explain away um, ambiguities in an ending, or um, discuss and ponder in depth that story over the course of the next 24 hours or week, as they just go over the story again and again in their heads. Um, I think that um, the best children's books engage the reader as an equal. And that's a very uncomfortable way for adults to think about children. And so more often we veer into didacticism, and it just becomes yet another time that we are teaching kids a lesson.
Mm. I guess the anecdote that I often share with teachers is about the rainbow fish. Do you have that? Do you have that story?
It's, yeah, it is. I know I think it's bigger over there than here, but it is quite popular in the US too.
Right.
Yeah.
So the rainbow fish is the story of a fish who doesn't have any friends. I mean, I'm oversimplifying here, but he doesn't have any friends. So what he learns is that if he takes one of his beautiful rainbow scales and gives it to the other fish so that he shares his scales, then he will get some friends, and he's left with just one scale like all of the other fish. And I don't like that book. Sorry, everybody in the audience who absolutely loves that and shares it with the children in their classes, but it's often used to reinforce the message that's already very heavy in the book. To me, it would be much more interesting to say, is that the only way that you can get friends, by giving your stuff away to them? We often layer it on through teaching as well.
I think that's right. And even stories that have lessons or morals that we agree with. I still wonder whether the most effective way to communicate that lesson, that moral to a child, is a book, right? Kids are constantly being inundated with messages from adults. There's no risk that they're going to make it through childhood without grown-ups telling them what to do. We do it all the time. Um, but in the US right now, it's kindness, and it has been for a long time. Like, books about being kind are a huge industry. And I think that it's driven in large part by adults being horrified at the unkind world that we have built, and that we're handing over to children. And so we get books that really can be reduced to two words: be kind, but they're 32 pages long. Um, and I think that children, adults, everyone should be kind. I think kindness is a virtue, absolutely. But I think that if just telling people to be kind was good enough, uh, then people would be kind. But the world is more complicated than that, right? And so how do we reconcile a world which kids see? This is the world they live in, and kids are expert noticers. They see uh a school principal and administrator lead an assembly about kindness, and then see that same administrator do something unkind that week. uh they all take the kindness pledge and then go out to recess, where they're cruel to each other. These kids, the same kids that all promise to be kind every day at school, right? How do we reconcile the fact that we know kindness is a virtue, but being human means making mistakes, and that there's a difference between the ideal world that we might share an idea of, and the world that we live in? It's deeply unsettling, and I think that fiction is great at stepping into those unsettling spaces, those irreconcilable truths, that two things can be true, that we should always be kind to each other, and that we are very often cruel to each other.
Yeah.
That is what stories are so good at. And of course, like, a parable is an effective mode of storytelling too. There are parables for adults. A simple moral encoded in a story meant to drive that point home. But the parable as an art form is so overrepresented in children's literature. And it starts to crowd out storytelling for storytelling's sake.
Mm.
And that's sad, because when we're talking about that, we're talking about art, right? And kids deserve art. And in fact, I think kids deserve the best art that we adults are capable of making for them.
Mm. I just want to say, you talked about books about kindness. We have lots of books, I'm sure you do too, about how much we love you. Guess how much I love you. I will love you forever, which is, the sort of classic, if you like, Robert Munch title in the US. So I wanted to ask you, you have a book called What is Love? And I did notice, let's just put up the cover here. On the publicity blurb, it says ideal for the reader of I Will Love You Forever. And yet this felt very ironic to me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one, we do not choose those comps or get input on the publicity blurb. That's funny. I feel well, you know what? I don't feel bad saying it. It's very funny that they said that, because I do not like I Will Love You Forever. And I don't think that, well, I mean, it doesn't have any influence on this book except for maybe influencing me in reaction to it, which is one of the most powerful ways to be influenced, actually. I think that I learn more from the books that I hate than the books that I love. But yeah, that is funny, because I hope that is not a a book that shares spiritual
Mm.
kinship with this one.
Just tell us briefly how it's different, how you see it as being different to those books that are all about professing how much you love. Um,
Yeah, so I think that this book is about a kid. It starts off, he asks his grandmother what love is, which was a question that really is a big question that I thought about a lot as a kid. I wondered what love is. People were talking about it all the time. People were singing about it in songs. And I wondered, I was like, am I going to fall in love? Am I going to love somebody? How will I know when I'm in love? What is this feeling? Everybody's talking about this thing. Um, can somebody just tell me what it is? And when I would ask adults about it, I would never get a clear definition, right? Because of course we kind of know what love is, but it's very hard to describe. And when that happens, we often revert to metaphor. That's what metaphor is for in our language. And so that is the animating principle of this book. This kid goes to various adults in various professions and asks them what love is. And they each explain what love means to them. Each of them gives a very different answer to the question. And they each use a metaphor to do it. So yeah, this says, I asked the fisherman, what is love? The fisherman smiled. Love is a fish. A fish? I said. It glimmers and splashes just out of reach. And the day that you catch it, if you know what you're doing, you give it a kiss and throw it back in the sea. But I don't like fish, I said. They're slimy and taste bad, and they have creepy eyes. The fisherman sighed. You do not understand. Um, so yeah, everybody gives a different metaphor, but everybody is also describing a different thing. They aren't all using metaphorical language, different metaphors to describe the same idea of love. They have different ideas of what love is, too. And the kid is left cold by all of these. I think that book really is about the limits of language too. In the end, it's experience that answers the question for him. And I think that I mean that book explicitly is. In some ways, I think all picture books are about the limits of language too. I think that uh, picture books allow you to write about things that language cannot describe, and to show things that you can't show in only pictures, because as we talked about when we were talking about the cover of La Porta Segreta, um, picture books, really the magic of them is the way that the story exists in the space between words and pictures. So uh yeah, this book I think is in some ways like uh just chasing down a lot of the formal ideas that I'm most excited about in picture book writing.
Mm. One of the other just to let people know that I've opened that Q&A and I'll keep my eye open. So when you feel you want to pop a question in, please do that. Find the Q&A and pop your questions in there. But there are quite a lot of other big issues that I want to address with Mac. And one is that, and I feel quite strongly about this, and I feel in some ways, I feel often that I'm swimming against the tide with this idea. And that's my concern about us appealing to the future, in terms of this will make you a
Yeah,
lifelong reader. And for
yeah.
somebody that is passionate about books, I know that I feel I'm kind of swimming against the general flow of things. Today, a reader, tomorrow, a leader. When I was
Mhm,
driving through Mexico City, that was everywhere. This
mhm.
idea of treating children like human becomings rather
Yes.
than human beings. And it does worry me. It becomes very evangelical, I think.
I'm really glad that chimed with you. Yeah, yeah. It's sort of an aside in the book, but there's way in which I think that sometimes even the people who are most passionate about children's literature and who work with children, when trying to explain the importance of children's books, they will appeal to the future, right? Just like you say, like future lead, readers are leaders. That's a big saying in schools over here too. um the book that a kid reads today will determine the kind of reader they become as an adult. If we want a society that reads and thinks critically about issues, we have to give children's books. It That kind of mentality, it puts all the value in the adult world, in the people that these kids will one day become. And what it ignores is the actual experience, the desire for a story of the child in front of you now. And look, it is true that reading has like tremendous impact on educational outcomes for children. I do think that I think it would be great to live in a society where adults read complicated literary fiction widely, and I think that probably children reading complicated literary fiction widely is more likely to result in that society than not. But that's not the reason for doing this. That isn't what excites me about it. What excites me is the living, breathing kid, the thinking, feeling kid who exists right now and needs a good story uh, as a place to sort of engage their imagination. The magic is what happens in that moment in childhood, and we can't locate the value of these books or the value of a child in the future. We need to pay attention to the kid who's right in front of us right now. This isn't training wheels for real life. This isn't practice sessions for real literature. In fact, this is a time when we have an openness, a keenness of observation, a love of language that demands the best that literature has to offer. Um, yeah, I think that's right.
Hmm. Can we turn our attention to notions of excellence? Um, in your book, you talk about taking a stand against mediocrity. So, what does that mean to you? What is an excellent children's book? Is it possible to define it?
Yeah, okay. I think an excellent children's book is a book that tells the truth about the I come back a lot to like John Keats' Truth and Beauty, right? Um, and so the same thing that makes a piece of art wonderful for adults, it's true for kids too. It tells the truth about the world in a way stylistically that is appropriate to the truth that's being conveyed. And then often I think of beauty in art, aesthetics, as something that entices us and maybe sort of bewilders us into a place that's sort of into an unsteady place. It allows us, it kind of shocks us into shedding some of our deeply held preconceived notions and um, yeah, and gets us ready for a truth. Um,
Mhm.
I think that great art for children does that too. It just it tells the truth um, about the world as children experience it. And
Mhm.
children's lives and children's brains and children's daily lives are different from adults' daily lives. And so the challenge for the children's book writer, I think, is uh, to master all those things that make excellence in literature generally, and then to apply those gifts in the service of children's own experiences. And that's what's really tricky. How do you, as an adult, uh, see the truth of a child's life? It's a huge challenge, but that's what I think. I think an excellent children's book is, um, yeah, it has all the hallmarks of excellent books for adults, but is relevant and recognized as true by the child reader.
Mm. And I guess the corollary of that is what is a bad what is a bad children's book?
Yeah, and look, I think that I also think that there should be bad children's books. We're all gonna have different definitions of this, but that children's books should be as varied in approach and style and quality as books for adults. And bad books and mediocre books are the price to pay for having good books too. And of course, none of us can agree what a good book or a bad book is anyway. And so that's where a lot of the fun of this too is debating merit, debating quality, and in doing so, engaging with our fellow human beings and communicating our points of view. I think that there's always a danger in kids' books of getting too celebratory. We have a very celebratory atmosphere around them, where it's like, let's read, let's celebrate all books. Every book is magical, and that can sometimes lead to something. I've seen this happen where a kid will really hate a book, and he's read it, and he's like, I don't like it. I really like, and a teacher, a librarian, a parent will say like, well, why don't you take another look at the book, read it again, and find one thing that you like about it. Um, why? Hating a book is part of loving literature, right? We are developing our aesthetics, our points of view. Now that doesn't mean that that book is bad, but it means that that kid thinks that book is bad. And uh, hating a book that somebody else loves and learning to talk to them about it, that's exciting. That's civics. Uh, that's part of being in a society, and that is a gift literature gives us too. So like I have like very strong opinions about what good books are and what bad books are for children, but I also want to ensure that children's books contain all those things. I want this big, unruly, polyphonic mess. And I want all of us, adults and kids, because we are all stakeholders in children's books, to be having big, messy, unruly, polyphonic, chaotic discussions to sort all this out. We don't
Mhm.
think the kids can handle it, but they can. They love talking about what they like and what they don't like. And yeah, so.
This will
Yeah,
be
yeah.
music to the ears of many of the people in this audience, I know, and I really hope that lots of questions are going to be coming in. I've got one and I'm going to come to that in a moment. But I think people are just fascinated listening to you. I want to turn my attention to children's questions because you have a lot of respect for the questions that children ask. Of course, you wrote a book as well about questions, 20 questions. Here it is. Um, Children's questions are so profound, aren't they? And I had this experience just a little while ago where I read Brian Cox's book, Forces of Nature. And in that book, he talks about why a snowflake has 6 points. And I thought, as a child, I would have asked the question, why does a snowflake have 6 points? But I have got to the age that I am, never having asked that question. And it really pulled me up thinking there are so many things I'm not asking questions about anymore,
Hmm.
but children ask those questions.
Yeah.
So I know that's something that you feel quite passionately about.
I do. I mean, I love that example too because it's like if you spend time around kids, that's one of the first things you notice, right? They just ask a ton of questions, and it's a reason I love hanging out with kids. Is they ask about the world. Sometimes they ask about the physical or observable world, and they ask questions that have answers that you know, and you can answer their questions. And it can kind of be exciting for you as an adult too, as you realize, like, wow, I have amassed some knowledge about the world. Then they ask those questions. Why does a snowflake have 6 points, for example? Which is a question that does have an answer that I don't know either. And that's amazing because it sends you uh it sends you to books, to computers to figure out the answer, and you start to learn alongside the kid, right? Now that can be humbling for a lot of adults, and I've seen adults sort of shrug it off or lie or just change the subject when even asked a question that does have an answer that that adult doesn't know, because we don't like to look like we don't know the answers in front of kids. It undermines our authority. It's so fun to learn alongside them. It's a way to re-engage with the world, and just like you say, Nikki, to learn things that you're curious about but had forgotten that you even didn't know. You had forgotten even to ask. You've forgotten even to notice the thing in the first place. Then you get category 3, questions that really don't have an answer. Very difficult questions. What is love? What happens after we die? What does God's face look like? Can trees have feelings? We get at the very, very limits of human knowledge, and this can make us really uncomfortable, especially questions about sad things. Death is one of the most classic things where, like, kids have so many questions. They're so comfortable talking about death. Adults are very uncomfortable talking about death generally, particularly to kids, because I think it's very upsetting to us, kids who symbolize futurity very often, youth, life. Um, we want to protect them from the knowledge of this great tragedy, this great sadness for us of human existence, right? And so we become very uncomfortable and shut down. Um, or we give them pat, tidy answers to questions that we haven't figured out because we know that there's no answer to. And that feels like a great crime to me as an adult, to simplify the world, to strip it of its mystery. That again, I think that something fiction is uniquely good at is sort of tracing the edges of the mysteries of life, celebrating not knowing, and sitting in ambiguity. So yeah, 20 questions as an exercise. 20 questions is fun for me because I think that uh, my favorite books, my favorite pieces of fiction leave a lot of space for the reader, right? And I think the best kids books do that. They leave empty spaces for kids to fill in. Um, Big questions for them to answer, things for them to figure out, basically to interpret the story, bring their intelligence and experience to a story with ambiguity in order to figure out what it means for them particularly.
Mm.
Um, That doesn't mean that, like, the most simplified version of that you'll hear authors say too is like, oh, my stories, you know what? It's up to the kid. It's up to the reader to decide what the story means. That's not wholly true either, right? It's a game. There, I'm putting things forward as an author. I'm setting out certain rules, certain boundaries. There is a sort of a banded set of interpretations that would be supported by that text, by that story. Other interpretations will fall outside that band of like, wow, that's actually that seems like a misread. It doesn't seem like that was really in the story. Reading reviews on Goodreads or the internet often feels like a bunch of adults finding things that are far outside the band of what I think is like a set of interpretations that could ever be reasonably made about my stories. Not anything goes, but there's how much the author puts out and how much power we give to the kids to decide what the story means. And 20 Questions, I think, pushes that. It turns the dial of power up on the kids to the highest point it could be. It's a set of questions. 19 of them have no firm answer. There are sort of provocations given by the illustrations, but it's really up to the kid to figure out what these things mean, what's happening in them. And I think it's one of those things again that kids are so much better at than adults. They're great at being asked a question that doesn't have one right answer and just bravely saying what it means to them. I remember uh, I was in an art museum in Italy, and even though I wrote that book that is published in Italian, I do not speak Italian. Um, but I was standing next to a father and his daughter, and they were Italian, speaking Italian, looking at a very confounding piece of contemporary art. And although I couldn't really understand what they were saying, I still I recognized the interaction, and I recognized the question that came from the father's mouth, which he pointed at the painting and asked some version of what do you notice? What do you think this means? Right? In that circumstance, I think I've seen many adults completely frozen when placed in front of a confounding painting and asked to talk about what it means. And it was just so cool to see this little girl immediately bravely walk up closer than any adult is comfortable walking up to a painting in a museum and start pointing to things and pointing out what she was noticing and explaining in a effusive Italian. And I didn't understand a word she was saying, but I understood that she knew what this painting meant to her, and she was so comfortable explaining it away. That is the magic of 20 Questions for me. It's really fun. We went around. Christian Robinson is the illustrator. When we went on tour, we went to elementary schools. So for us, it's like kindergartners are 5. So we would talk to 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds. The 5-year-olds were the best at reading that book. They were the most comfortable giving answers, and we never got the same answer twice. 6-year-olds still very good. As kids got older, they got more and more afraid of getting the question wrong. They wanted the right answer, and they were more nervous to speak, more frustrated that there wasn't a right answer. Some of that may be just developmental, what our brains are capable of doing at different ages, but I think a lot of that is socialized into kids too. We've given them immense rewards by that point for giving the correct answer, and maybe done a poor job of presenting to them the truth about life, which is that there are many questions that don't have an answer or that have more than one answer, and that that those are actually some of the most interesting intellectual places to hang out.
And maybe we get hung up on interpretation. As you say, there are limits to the limits of interpretation. I think that was Umberto Eco who wrote that. I hope I'm in the right place there. But a book can have significance for you, which is beyond interpretation. And I also think the difference between comprehension and apprehension, which is knowing something through your senses rather than through your logic and your
Mhm,
reasoning. And
mhm,
I think we don't always value that as much as we
mhm.
do the rational and the reasoning.
Yeah, totally agree. I think that's right. Yeah. And children's genius is often in apprehension, right?
Mm.
It is in feeling, in noticing, in being embodied in the world, and the the genius with which they take things in and process them, often in ways that are not rational, but are true and authentic to their experience. Um, yeah, it's amazing. Some of my favorite, I there's a writer I love, Margaret Wise Brown, um, who's famous in the U.S. for writing a book called Goodnight Moon, but wrote more than 100 books. We talk about her a lot in the Porta Segreta. I think that is her genius. Is her work closer comes closest to that sort of that pattern of thinking, of experiencing that kids have, and can often seem, her books can seem very strange and foreign to adults, but she was able to do that. She's able to write in exactly the way that you're talking about.
Mm. I've got so many questions that we're flooded with questions now, so I
Okay.
am going to come to those. But I have one last question before coming to the audience questions, which I really do want to make sure we touch on. And that's the fact that obviously you've made lots of picture books with some of the finest illustrators: John Classen, Christian Robinson, Carson Ellis, we've talked about. And I just feel sometimes that with picture books, the pictures get more attention than the text. And the text is so important, the rhythm of the text. And I think sometimes we sell children short with the writing of the text in picture books. I feel that quite strongly. You know, when I think of your books, obviously, but the great Morris Sendak, the night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind or another, his mother called him Wild Thing, and Max said, "I'll eat you up." So he was sent to bed without eating anything. That night in
Every
Max's
night
room,
in
a
Max's room,
forest
a
grew
forest
and
grew
grew.
and grew and grew
I know
till
you,
the walls, no,
the
till the ceiling
ceiling,
hung with vines, and the walls became the world all around.
and an ocean tumbled by with a private, etc. That's lodged in our ear
I
because of the
know.
rhythm of that text.
Sendex.
Maybe I'm just telling you what I think here, but I just
No,
wonder.
I this is so funny that you say that. Okay, because I agree completely. Like I actually think Sendak is one of the greatest illustrators to live, right? He is like on a William Blake level of genius in what he was able to do, drawing. But also as a writer, and this goes to your point. I think that if you only write picture books, I think that yeah, picture book writing is undervalued. And if you were an author who does not draw, there's an anonymity to it that I actually find very exciting. You can disappear into a book, into a story, change your style, because I think that the nature of how we engage with picture books, the pictures are first, and the style of the picture book, the style of the illustration, becomes sort of the style of the book. And so, like, especially John Clausen, for instance, I work with him a ton. He has a very distinctive visual style. He's a brilliant writer on his own, and I know when I write and illustrate with John, there's a way in which, like, my story is going to be subsumed into John's visual universe. That's a very happy thing. I think John's visual universe is one of the best around. Um, but it is primary so that, like, kids will think that I wrote I Want My Hat Back, John wrote that, or they will think that John wrote these books because the characters have the same kinds of eyes, right? Um, our experience with picture books is pictures first, and that's very cool, but it does lead to maybe lowered expectations for a picture book text. And you see that even when, in someone like Sendak, who did both of those things, but I agree, is totally underrated as a writer. One of the greatest prose stylists of the 20th century. Um, I John and I actually we just started we like literally just started a a Substack newsletter about picture books called Looking at Picture Books. And tomorrow we're going to have a post about where the wild things are. We've been spending so much time with that book, thinking about it. I know that book so well. I've loved that book so much since I was a kid. We spent weeks thinking about it, talking about it. And it's one of those things that, like, we the more you think about it, its magnificence, but also its mysteries only deepen. Uh, and I'm just like, we didn't even cover. We make a couple references to how beautiful the text is, but even there in our post, I am so aware that, like, as a picture book writer, I did not talk enough about how beautiful the language is.
Mm.
Um, and I do think, again, like, kids have a real love of language. They have a love just for the pure sound, the joy of sounds that is so important to poetry and belletristic prose. They are more attuned to those than we are as adults. And the possibilities of language, of even elevated language, right? Because picture books are read out loud to kids rather than read by kids, you're liberated in terms of where you pitch vocabulary and how complex you make your syntax, because it's going to be an adult reading these things to kids. Um, and I think the joy and experience, sometimes, like, I will put words in my books that adults will be like, kids don't know these words. Very often when they're upset about it, I think it's also because they didn't know that word, and they had to go to a dictionary to look it up. That's why we read books. Like, there's
Exactly.
nothing wrong with that. I love it when I'm reading a novel and I come out knowing 10 or 15 new words. There's some novels I finish and I've learned 60 or 70 new words. This is not a crime. And we need to afford kids uh the same liberty in engaging with language that we give to ourselves, right? If we're reading something and we don't know a word, we can look up what it means. We can try to figure out what it means by context, and maybe we'll go get close. Or we can just not look up what it means and move on. And often that isn't just ignoring it. There is a joy that can be taken in the way that word sounds that we can still have access to. There's even, like, I think, a kind of like an aesthetic pleasure to not knowing something, to
Mm.
struggling to get something, to not being able to quite make the connection. Um,
Interesting.
Literature can create that feeling in the reader, but that is not the only time that we as people will experience that feeling, right? And so, like, there's an aesthetics of not knowing. Yeah. So I went everywhere on that, but I think the shortest answer is I think that is one of the most beautiful manuscripts that has ever been created. And I also think that picture book writing doesn't just need to be well crafted from just like a prose standpoint, but also there are technical requirements of a picture book manuscript, in terms of, like, where you're breaking your pages, how much action you're presenting at a time, and what space you're leaving for the illustrator. Um, it's a lot more. It has a lot more in common with, a very restrictive poetic form. It's like villanelle writing or something, where there are all of these rules, but we don't think about it or talk about it that way. And you'll often see great novelists write picture books, and the picture books are just flat. They're dead. The sentences are very pretty. You can say, like, this is very well written, but it's a bad picture book. When you're reading it in front of kids, everybody's bored. The kids are bored, you're bored, and you can't figure out why it's not working because this novelist is very good and the sentences seem great, but it's not a picture book. So you have to be good at all of this other stuff and then figure out how picture books actually work.
Let's come to those audience questions.
Right.
Well, this is a question everybody's want to ask, I think, because it's repeated many times in the quick Q&A here. So it's got a quick answer, I guess.
Yeah, it's coming. Okay, so yes, why is the book that we've been talking about not in English? It's gonna come out in English. I wrote it in Italian first. I was visiting my publisher in Italy, and I love my editors there. I've been working with them since the very beginning of my career. And one of my editors was like, "I have an idea for you. You should write a book about children's books for adults." And I'd been thinking about doing that for a long time. I told him that. I said, that would be a dream. And he's like, "Great. And you should publish it first with Terra de Mezzo." And I said, "Great." And that's not how these things usually go, but I really think that they asked. Like they wanted to do this thing that I'd been wanting to do as well. And when you find that kind of confluence and you're on the same page, that's who you want to make the book with. And it was really exciting to uh to make it with these smart, engaged editors who thought that there was an audience for this, which I think many adults who work in children's publishing in the US, where would be the most logical place for me to publish this first, I think would doubt that there would be um, an interest in this topic. I think we all know that that's not true, but but I think that it seemed very natural to my editors over there that this would be something worthy of attention. And so we did it there first. But it's going to come out in English. It will.
Great.
I like
Let's
how you were like, Nikki, by the way, you're like, this would be a very short answer. And then I was like, cool. Let me set the clock for 7 minutes.
You've worked with incredible illustrators.
Yes. Yeah. Uh, I've been very lucky. I think that it's really common in picture book making for authors and illustrators to be kept separate, and often the author has no say in who illustrates their texts. But publishers have always been very generous and at least included me in the discussion of who we're going to bring on as an illustrator. Sometimes the illustrator and I will go to the publisher together, which is not how it usually happens, but we've been lucky to work that way sometimes. And then, yeah, I think that I try to write manuscripts that are very collaborative in their nature, that leave lots of opportunities for the illustrations. In some ways, I think one of my main jobs when I'm writing is to just build like a sturdy scaffolding upon which the illustrations can come and be the finished thing. Sometimes I work really closely with the illustrator. Even John Clausen, who I work with more than any other illustrator, every one of our books has been different. Sometimes we are like going back and forth, really sort of simultaneously figuring out words and pictures and opining on each. Other times have been more like the classic way in which he gets a manuscript and just figures out how he wants to illustrate it. We've done it all ways, but I think that uh, whether the author and illustrator are communicating a ton or not at all, the words and pictures have to dance together. If you write picture books and you don't illustrate them, it's your job to figure out how to be a good dance partner while you're making this thing alone.
Love that. So,
Oh, do you always know the twist at the ending, or do you have to write your way to it? Good question. I like to find my endings as I go along. Um, I think that I like to find an ending that does feel surprising, but feels like the natural consequence of what my characters want and what has already happened in the story, and is not driven by any sort of like ideas of like the 7 forms of stories that have always been told, or Freytag's triangle, or how this is supposed to end. I like to find it in just sort of the consequences of things that I've set in motion. Um, it's not always the case. Sometimes I know, like Sam and Dave dig a hole. We knew at the start that it was going to end basically that way, and that's probably like the biggest twist ending that I've written. But in general, I like to find the ending along the way. That might mean very early on I see like, oh, that's how this is gonna end. But but yeah, it's more improvisational in that, in terms of like I look at what I've said so far and what that means for how this story must end.
Mm. This relates to a discussion that we've had, but I think the last part of the question is particularly apposite.
Yeah. What is the most challenging question a child has ever asked you, and how did you respond? I mean, I think that I'm trying to think of what the most challenging question the kid has asked me. I feel like I've been asked a bunch, and the way I respond if I don't know is I am fine saying that I don't know. To kids, it's much easier for me to say that to a kid than it is for me to say that to an adult. I don't know. I think I'm my best self around children, and with adults I can be impatient. I can really, I would be much more desirous of seeming like I'm an expert in things. With kids, I feel like I can be a more authentic, patient, present person. I don't know why that is, but it's probably a big reason that I like making books for them. The hardest question I've ever seen a kid ask, and well, I wasn't asked this. It was I was at an elementary school over here, and I saw a kid. We were having lunch with a few kids who were like really into writing in the faculty lounge. And also that day, there was going to be an like we they have various names here in the US, but like an active shooter drill, that in elementary schools kids rehearse for what they will do if a shooter comes into the building. Um, and this drill had some euphemistic name. I forget what it was exactly, but this kid who was in second or third grade asked the principal, because she was like, "Oh, this afternoon we have the blah blah drill." And he's like, "What is that drill all about?" And she's like, "Well, it's what we would do if somebody came into the building." And she just kept trying to dance around it, and he kept asking more and more questions. And finally he said, like, "Why? Like, why would anybody come to our school and do this?" Um, and the whole room was really quiet. It was put to the principal. She did as good a job at explaining it as I think a principal could, but there's no good explanation for that, right? It's yet another way that we as adults have failed and continue to fail kids. And uh, yeah, I think that again, acknowledging that we have failed kids, that we have not built a perfect world. What do you do? What do you do when you see the abyss like that? It's awful. It's awful for adults. It's awful for kids. It's awful for people. I don't know what you do. One thing that people do, and I understand why, is they just turn to despair. Other people turn to certainty, right? And they have certainty in a place where I don't see any certainty. But maybe it's more comforting to ignore the world and to maintain your certainty. For me, the solace has always been literature, stories, not as a panacea, not as something that dulls me, but that's something that teaches me to live in with imperfection, with sadness, with tragedy, and not to be complacent about it, but just to sort of get the strength to keep going after that. But yeah, that's the hardest question I've ever seen a kid ask. And felt very lucky that I was not the one being asked that, because I wouldn't have done as good a job as that principal did.
Can I just say to everybody that put questions in the Q&A, because there were lots of them there, and I closed the Q&A thinking that the questions would stay up and I could then forward the questions to you, Mac, but they've all disappeared. So if you had a question and it hasn't gone up on screen and you really want to ask it, could I ask people to put them in the chat and I'll export the chats and forward it to you? Would that be
It's fine.
an
Yeah,
okay thing to do?
absolutely.
Because I didn't mean to cut people off there, but that's that's what happened. So to anybody listening, please do take a moment now just to repeat your question in the chat. What we're going to do now as we come to the end, you must be exhausted talking to us for
I
so
love it.
long,
I love it.
Matt, but we've got so many more questions. I've got a feeling that we might have to try and ask you if you'll come back again and talk to us at another time as well.
I would love to.
That would be great. What we're going to do, though, is to first of all let me thank the audience for coming along and asking so many questions. And we had such a huge turnout tonight, which is a testament to the affection with which your books are held, with teachers, librarians here in the UK. So I would like to thank them. But of course, I really want to thank you you've given me so much to think about. You have taken my thinking even deeper, and I'm so grateful for that. I know you're going to read us out. We have got a sneak peek of Santa's first Christmas. So, for everybody that's with us, that's how we're going to end our event this evening. Mac's going to read us out with Santa's first Christmas. And as I say, it's not published yet here in the UK, later this month. And then at the very end, there's just a short video that shows you some other things that are coming up here on Thursday evenings. Wow, it's been amazing having you with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for being here. I think to gather as adults who care about children's books and to talk them over with each other is just it's very soul nourishing for me, and so I really appreciate the invitation, and thank you everyone for your thoughtful questions and comments and thoughts, which I've loved reading. All right, Santa's First Christmas. And this book is by me and Sydney Smith. In the old days, Santa didn't have Christmas. All year he made toys at the North Pole, which he loaded up in his sleigh each Christmas Eve, then flew all over the world to place under trees. When he got home, he slept. And when he woke up Christmas morning, he went back to work. That's it. That's it? Asked a bear who lived near the North Pole and was just passing by on the way back to his cave. Santa doesn't do anything special. He sleeps in, said the elves. An extra half hour. The bear frowned. Look, I love to sleep. But still, it's Christmas. The elves were embarrassed. We should do something special for Santa, they said. And then they did. When Santa woke up that morning, the elves brought him breakfast in bed. What's all this? Santa asked. It's Christmas, they said. Merry Christmas. Santa smiled. Thank you, he said. Looks delicious. Merry Christmas. But when he'd finished his donuts, he put on his suit and picked up his tools. Wait, said the elves. We have to go pick out a tree. For who? Santa asked. For you, the elves said. For what? Santa asked. For Christmas. Santa put down his hammer. Well, that sounds nice. In the forest, Santa pointed to a handsome spruce. It's big, said an elf. It sure is, Santa said. It's just, said the elf, I think it's too big to fit in your house. Oh, it'll fit, Santa said. Somehow or other, they got the tree in, and they decorated with tinsel and candy canes and glass balls and pigs made out of gingerbread. It's beautiful, Santa said. Stockings next, said the elves, and they produced a long woolly stocking that bore Santa's name. Santa fastened his stocking to the mantelpiece with care. Then he put up the elves, since they couldn't reach very high. And when he was done, he fetched wood and lit a warm fire. This is fun, Santa said. What's next? They strung the North Pole with colorful lights. Then they counted to 3. 1, 2, 3. In the kitchen, the elves mixed flour and sugar and eggs in a huge bowl. They gave Santa the spoon to lick while they rolled out the dough, which they cut into fancy shapes. But when the biscuits came out of the oven, Santa was allowed only one. We have to save them, said the elves, to leave out with some milk. For you know who. But, Santa said, the elves looked at him sternly. And when they caught Santa putting his fingers in the icing, they asked him to go to another room. So Santa found a warm spot in a chair by the fire, where several elves had gathered to tell ghost stories and read poems out loud. When it was Santa's turn, he picked up a fat book bound in brown leather. He had a broad face and a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. Santa put down the book on his knee and smiled. I really do laugh like that, he said. And then he did. The door flew open. A flurry of snow blew in, and someone with a beard, dressed in red, with a sack full of gifts, bounded into the room, roaring, Ho, ho, ho! Santa could tell who it was, but he didn't say. The first gift was for Santa, from one of the elves. The rest of the gifts were for Santa, too. I love them, Santa said. I love them all. Then the bearded someone in red loaded up all the stockings with black licorice and red apples and socks rolled into balls. But there was no time for sweets or fruit or trying on socks. For the table was set with mince pies and pudding and rolls and roasts, Brussels sprouts, gravies, horseradish sauce, sparkling crystal glasses filled with mulled wine, a Yule log, poached pears, candy canes, several pies, and a ginger stout cake, powdered with sugar, 6 layers high. Santa's eyes crinkled a little and twinkled a little, and in the light of the candles, the elves were certain that Santa's eyes glistened a little. Merry Christmas, he said. Merry Christmas, they cried, and they ate food and sang carols all through the night. Santa said, we should do this every year. And now they do.